Welcome to this week's edition of Biblically Grounded, the podcast where we talk about the Bible and archaeology and various apologetic subjects. Now, today I've got a special guest. I've got someone who I've worked with for the past couple of years. I've gotten to know who is actually a pretty well-known person when it comes to archaeology in the Holy Land, and when it comes to small finds and reconstructing some of the things from the past that are intricate, to say the least. So today we're talking to Frankie Snyder. Frankie, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Clayton, for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you. I've got to say something to our audience I thought was fascinating when I first started digging. So Frankie is our small finds expert. She runs the wet sifting station at Tel Shiloh, and I learned my first year digging there, people were coming to visit our site, not to see all the archaeology that we're doing, but to see the legendary Frankie Snyder. And I'm not kidding about that. People came just to see her. So Frankie, it is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for the compliment.
Well, you're welcome. So what we're talking about today is a pretty specific find or a specific subject. We're talking about King Herod and his floors. That at first you go, why would we talk about King Herod and his floors? But Frankie, you're known, what's your nickname?
I'm the floor lady.
Yes, well, I remember one time you gave me your business card and it's the floor lady. And I thought that was fascinating because you've been working on reconstruction on Herod's floors, on the floors of what could be Herod's temple. At least floors from the Temple Mount. So tell us, before we get into that specifically, how did you get involved in archaeology? What's your background?
My degrees are not in archaeology. My first degree was in mathematics. My second degree was in Judaic studies. I made Aliyah, meaning I moved over to Israel as a resident there in 2007. And before my contemporary Hebrew classes started, I wanted to volunteer for a few weeks doing something. So I found the Temple Mount Sifting Project. So I started just volunteering over there. And one of the things we were finding were these beautiful tiles in geometric shapes, triangles, rectangles, squares. And we began finding these. And this was something I found really, really fascinating. I also turned out to be very good at wet sifting, and that the second day I was there, I found 4 coins. So about 2 weeks later, I got offered a job there. So here I was in Israel, barely over a month, could not speak the language, and I had a paying job, which was, hey, good, I can stay here now. Or I have a way to finance my staying here. So it was working there at the sifting project that I began to work with these geometrically shaped tiles because of my mathematical background. And that's how I got started with the floors, but also with all the wet sifting I was doing. When Scott Stripling started the excavation at Tel Shiloh, he was putting in a full wet sifting station there. And he asked me to come up there to help supervise and teach people how to do wet sifting, because at the time, I was probably the most experienced wet sifter in the country. So that's my experience in the wet sifting with small objects. But what I got known for was the mathematical application that I was able to bring to the archaeological finds with the tiles that were being found, not only there on the Temple Mount, but also at 8 different Herodian palaces.
Yes, so we had an opportunity a year ago. You took a number of us to Herodium to look around at Herod's palace in Herodium. So are you seeing then connections between the different locations where Herod had large buildings constructed, where he had his construction projects?
Totally. In order to figure out what was going on with the tiles on the Temple Mount, because they were found individually loose in a garbage pile, I had to have some kind of a context. And so what I had to do was go around to all these different palaces that Herod had built and look at the floors he used there in order to learn how he designed floors, or how his mason designed floors, the sizes, the shapes, the materials that were used. It was only by studying Herod's palaces could I go back to the Temple Mount and say, okay, now I can figure out how to use these tiles, what kind of designs they were used in, and possibly even how they were being used, where they were being used there on the Temple Mount.
Wow, that is so I have a feeling we're about to learn about a very intricate story. You said your background's in mathematics, and I know geometry is involved. And these are the
Totally
things.
geometry.
See, that got me in school. So I'm fascinated by someone who's able to do this and to look at these shapes and to be able to figure out what's going on. So I'm not going to hold you back. I'm going to let you go ahead and start telling us about Herod's floors.
So what I'm going to talk to you today is about the geometry of King Herod the Great, and specifically about a triangle that I call Herod's triangle. It's a specific shape that he liked using in his floors. But I'm going to take you first to the location where he found these tiles. This is the Second Temple model that sits at the Israel Museum. On this model, I marked first where the original 500 cubit by 500 cubit platform was from the time of King Solomon. He had a portico along the east side. We call it Solomon's portico. We'll see that later. And then the temple stood here in the middle. Later on, during the Hasmonean period, the Temple Mount was extended a little bit to the south. And with King Herod, he enlarged it to the south, a little bit to the west, and a lot to the north. He literally doubled the size of the Temple Mount and added all these porticos. This is called a stoa, or it's a giant portico that's here, and then small porches or porticos that went the other three sides around the Temple Mount. One of the things that we know that King Herod liked to use were tiles that are called opus sectilla tiles. And opus sectilla is a technique for using cut and polished stones. Sometimes they were in geometric shapes, and sometimes they form figurative images. But because of the second commandment, and don't make carved idols, in Israel, you do not see figurative images, you only see geometric shapes. King Herod imported this craft to use at his palaces and then also on the Temple Mount. So the palaces that I have studied are Banyas, Caesarea or Caesarea, Kypros, Jericho, Herod's palace in Jerusalem, Herodian, Machaerus, and Masada. We also have Herod Antipas's palace, which has these kind of floors in it here at Tiberias. We have a Herodian era fortified manor house at Ramat Hanadiv, which used these tiles. This was either Herod's or a relative of his or one of his patrons. And then in Jerusalem, we also have the Temple Mount. Now, for the Temple Mount, we have literary evidence that this floor up there was very fancy. Josephus tells us that the open courts of the Temple Mount were from end to end variegated with pavings of all manner and color of stones. So we know there were some really beautiful tiles up there. It wasn't all cream colored limestone. We also have epigraphic evidence. During Benjamin Mazar's Ophel digs, he found an inscription, and it basically says, during the 20th regnal year of a king who was not also the high priest, a man named Paris from the island of Rhodes donated money to help with the expenses of paving a floor in the area of the temple. Now, who is this king? Well, it had to be somebody who reigned at least 20 years, meaning King Herod, and it had to be somebody who did not also serve as the high priest. Now, during the Hasmonean period, whoever was the high priest was also the king. And then during the Herodian period, that didn't hold anymore. There was a high priest and there was a king. So we need something after the Hasmonean period, which takes us into the Herodian one, and King Herod's the only one who served for 20 years. So we know about fancy floors then from this inscription. Then we also have physical evidence. At the Temple Mount Sifting Project, which was being conducted in Emma Park, which is part of the city of David. We were finding all kinds of polished tiles. They came in all different sizes and shapes and colors. We found over 600 that I cataloged saying, these are parts of these opus sectilla tiles. But you can see here, lots of different sizes and shapes, but there were also different time periods. So one of the three major questions I had to address was, which of these were specifically from the time of King Herod? What kind of patterns did he use? And where on the Temple Mount did he use them? In order to figure out that, I needed to look at what Herod had done with these kind of floors at his palaces. So I actually made a trip to Masada. That was one of the first places we looked, and looked at the floors, measured the tiles, saw the materials he was using, saw the patterns he was using. Then Herodian. This is, Clayton, this is where you mentioned that we went, because
Yes.
here they had these fancy floors up here in Herod's palace at the top of the hill, and also down at the bottom of the hill over in this area is a huge bathhouse that was part of what I call a country club for his friends and relatives. They were some of these really fancy floors in here.
So you're showing us a number of building projects that King Herod the Great, and he was called the Great because of his building, correct?
Yes,
So you're
that's
showing
one of
us,
the reasons. Yes.
yeah, one of them, a number of building projects. He had palaces. You keep mentioning palaces, and I've seen several of them. The one in Jericho is fascinating to visit. Why did Herod do all these building projects? Why did he have so many palaces and places that were built up so grandly?
A lot of these places were palaces from the Hasmonean period that he renovated. He may have used them. Sometimes they were used by other members of his family. Some of them were also seasonal. Like Jericho is the palace that he liked to use in the wintertime because Jericho doesn't get cold, whereas Jerusalem can get quite cold in the wintertime. So Jericho was the winter palace, whereas um, Jerusalem was the summer palace. The one at Tiberias that's down here, this was his son that built that one. Kypros is up on a ridge line up above Jericho, and it also had a Hasmonean palace there that was renovated and converted into a larger palace in that place. Machaerus, the one up here in the upper right. Machaerus is over in Jordan on the other side of the Dead Sea. Here's your Dead Sea there. There's Israel on that side. This is Jordan on this side. Machaerus is the place where Herod Antipas decapitated John the Baptist. That's the story that takes place at Machaerus. In Jericho down here, this is like I said, this was his winter palace. It's a very, very large dining room, and you can see a floor here with all these little indentations where you can see where 25 to 26,000 tiles were used to pave this floor. At Kypros, there was a bathhouse up at the very top that had beautiful floors in it. And here at in Tiberias, you can still see in this picture some of the actual tiles left over from 2,000 years ago from Herod Antipas's palace. So it was by studying the floors in all of these different places, the sizes of the tiles, the type of materials, and the patterns, I was able to figure out then what was going on the Temple Mount. What I looked at each of these places were 5 characteristics of the tiles: their size, their shape, the material that was used, the specific color, and the craftsmanship, meaning how they were made. One of the things I found was King Herod was using 2 basic Roman-sized tiles. First one, that is 1 Roman foot on a side. Now, a Roman foot, here's my Roman foot ruler over here. There's only this much difference between the Roman foot and the imperial foot that you use. It's just a tiny little bit smaller. So most of the tiles were this size square. Other ones were a smaller size. They're 1 Roman foot on a diagonal, meaning it would fit nicely inside of here. Now, in centimeters, which we don't use much in the US, but in archaeological reports, everything's done in centimeters because that's the universal length. It's the larger one is 29.6 centimeters, being just barely less than the foot that you're used to. And then the other one is 20.9 centimeters. So about this size. Now, these two sizes are actually preserved for us today in what you call European paper. The technical name for it is A4 paper. And it turns out, quite coincidentally, that it is 1 Roman foot tall, and it is the shorter length of 29 centimeters wide. Now, I'm not sure how it got that way, but it's a great example for people if you're trying to explain how big a Roman foot is. Oh, it's the paper you use all the time. You know A4 paper as European paper. It's slightly narrower than your 8.5 by 11 and slightly longer. But it's the standard paper used everywhere in the world, except the United States.
Already there's this dizzying amount of math going into this. I am
Yes.
fascinated by how you're able to decipher these things.
And this was done just by sitting there looking at the tiles and measuring them. I had to, because nobody really had a record of all the sizes. One of the things that I noticed was Herod really liked to use this shaped triangle. And because of it, I called it Herod's triangle. It is an isosceles triangle, meaning one that has two sides the same and one that's different, where the base of the triangle is equal to the height, just like a triangle built inside of a square. It has these really funny corners of 52 degrees, 64, and 64. Okay. You rarely see it in Roman floors, but it's frequently seen in King Herod's floors. And sometimes it was used just this tile alone to cover a huge floor area, and other time for more complex patterns. Now, this triangle actually does have a mathematical name. It's called a root 5 triangle, because if you look at the ratios to it, if you take this base here as 1 unit, then this would be 2 units, and the length here is the square root of 5. And every time you show the square root radical to any archaeologist, they panic, their eyes glaze over, and they run in the other directions. So I don't show them this at all. I just show them this diagram on the other side and say, oh, it's a square that was created inside of a triangle was created inside of a square. Now, what King Herod did was he would substitute in his triangle, this 52-64 thing, for more commonly used equilateral triangles with the 60-60-60 corners that are all the same, and for a skinnier one at 45 degrees, which is half of the 90-degree square corner. So he would substitute his triangle into patterns that were very common in the Roman world. So look at this first one. Here at Herculaneum, here's a floor. It's made with all triangles, but these are all equilateral, meaning each side is the same. Okay. And here's the floor at Masada, again, only made with triangles. Now, this floor is still there at Masada. When you go, you can see it. And it's made with Herod's patterns. Now, I'm going to show you in diagrams. The standard Roman pattern used what's called equilateral triangles, 3 equal sides. Herod's used the isosceles, meaning 2 sides are the same and one was skinnier. Also, the way he set them was slightly different. In a Roman pattern, you would put point to point and base to base. And in Herod's, you put point to base, the point of the triangle to the base of the other one, the point to the base. So he took the popular standard Roman pattern and he tweaked it just enough that he put his own signature on the floors where he used this pattern. Here's another example of him tweaking a floor pattern to put his own signature on it. This was a common floor pattern. I found this one in Pompeii that uses squares, and this shape is called a rhombus. The plural is rhombi, not really rhombuses, although it's sort of accepted in English because people don't know to use the word rhombi. Okay. And here's one he used in Lower Herodian. Now, they look sort of the same, but I'm going to show you in the diagram here. I want you to look at this rhombus and this rhombus. Clayton, do you see a difference in them other than one is black and one is white? What about the size of this one, the standard Roman one, and the size of Herod's one? Can you
Sure.
see a difference?
Yeah, Herod's looks like it's narrower, longer slightly, more.
Exactly. You pegged
Yeah.
it right there. what Herod did, rather on the regular Roman pattern on a rhombus, he took two of those equilateral triangles, meaning three sides the same, he put them together and created a rhombus. Here, Herod took his that was skinnier and narrower. So in the pattern, then you have a longer, skinnier rhombus. So he took the standard Roman pattern and he put his signature right there in the floor because he used this triangle that really only shows up in his floors. Here's another place. On the Temple Mount, we have this pinwheel pattern. Okay, I think this is the pattern that was used. Here's the pinwheel that was used in Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli over in Italy. So you can see the pinwheel pattern in here. And here's one from the Temple Mount using a tile that I found there. And here's part of another tile. Herod did the same trick on this one. In a standard Roman pattern, you use 8 triangles that are identical, all with a 45-degree angle here. What did Herod do? He put his triangle at the north, south, east, and west sides, which made it have a skinnier triangle over here. So again, he put his signature there by using this special triangle. Here's another one, again from Herod's palace in Tivoli. These patterns look quite similar, but let me show you the graphic of them. Here again, he took, there was a standard 45-degree angle right here, and he turned it into his triangle. So now the triangles are a little bit fatter than the Roman one. The square in the middle is a little bit bigger one. But again, here's Herod's signature right there using his triangle. So this is how he used this one triangle to take regular Roman patterns and put his signature on everything that he was doing. Another way that he used this triangle was to generate a pattern. So here I've taken 4 Herod's triangles, a yellow one, a red one, a blue one, a green one. I have superimposed them on top of each other. Now I've placed a square in the middle, and I've accentuated these 4 triangles at each corner. This large red triangle is a Herod's triangle, and this little one up here, this is a Herod's triangle. So now we have a square with 4 Herod's triangles running around it. And he actually used this pattern then to generate floor patterns. Here we have 4 Herod's triangles. I found this one in the middle of a group demonstration where I take a bucket of dirt, dump it on the tray and say, okay, here's what we're looking for. And oh, look, we have found a Herod's triangle. I mean, it was just totally off the wall when I did it. I couldn't believe it.
What you've got though, you've got a recognizable pattern. This is a fingerprint of Herod or his his architect.
Is that architect, his mason? Yes, his own fingerprint, right.
Do you see this in other people's architecture, or is this unique to Herod?
This is unique to Herod. It's amazing. Another place is using the same pattern. If we accentuate this kite-shaped pattern over here, I found one of these kite-shaped tiles, and it's like, how do I use this kite? And I realized, here's the kite. It fit perfectly, fit exactly in there. So we knew that Herod used this pattern because this is a really weird shape. And to find a tile like that that fits perfectly into the pattern was really amazing. So this is another pattern we think was used on the Temple Mount. Now, this 4-pointed star pattern turns out to be really, really neat. Here is a place where Herod used this 4-pointed star to create a unique floor. This is the pattern of a floor down in Jericho. It's the one I showed you earlier with that big dining room. This is the pattern that was used in the middle of the floor. I stared at this pattern for several years going, that is really neat, but I can't figure out how you generate the pattern. What's going on here? And one day it was like, go, I'm going to turn this into a colored picture so that you can see this. It turns out that the entire floor was created by using this 4-pointed star motif and overlapping it. And this is the only pattern used in here. So you can see the little green 4-pointed stars. But now look, Here's a giant red four-pointed star, overlapping a giant blue four-pointed star, overlapping a giant red star. So he used this pattern, this motif, repeating it to create an entire unique floor. There is not another floor like this in the world. I can guarantee that one.
Wow.
Now, back to the Temple Mount. Where might Herod have used these floors? Well, the floor usually need to be under a roof. And so a really good example of where it might have been would have been in the southern stoa or in these porticos or porches that he added all the way along. Now, this is Solomon's original portico here. Herod added some more. Of course, Herod renovated it, but Herod added portico here to the north, to the west, and the big stoa to the south. This royal porch down here extended across the southern end of the Temple Mount. And this is probably the place where Jesus overturned the table of the money changers. This is a place where people would bring their foreign money when they were coming to the city for the high holidays. They would come and they would exchange their money for the Jewish shekel, especially the half shekel that they pay their temple tax. And so this is probably the location where Jesus overturned the table of the money changers. And this is a really good, it's a really good chance that this is where this really decorative floor was, all these tiles that we found. Another place might be here in Solomon's portico. Like I said, this was part of Solomon's square Temple Mount. And then Herod added on more porches to the north and south of it and all the way around it. And we have several stories that take place there. When Jesus walked on the Temple Mount, in the portico of Solomon, and then it says during the festival of dedication, which is Hanukkah. So Jesus and his disciples were walking right here, walking on these very floors, these very tiles that I was working with from the Temple Mount.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you're dealing these tiles. These are not just something about King Herod. These tiles were used on the Temple Mount in the places where we read in the Bible about Jesus and the disciples walking. These were the floors.
Right. These are the floors where my ancestors, the Jews, would have come many, many years ago for the holidays. But these are also the floors where Jesus and his disciples walked on these floors on a daily basis. We have the story of the widow's mite, and it said Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watch the crowd putting money into the treasury. Okay, if he's sitting opposite the treasury, then on the map here, it says Court of the Women. There's another name for this area, and it's called the Treasury. That's because there were charity boxes sitting out here, and people would bring their money and put them into charity boxes. In Hebrew, it's called a tzedakah box, but it's a charity box. And everybody was sitting there opposite the treasury. So they're sitting outside the gate over here. Here's where they're sitting. Jesus was sitting here, watching through the gateway, watching the woman put her little tiny coin into a charity box. So again, we put Jesus right here in this portico, which probably had these beautiful tiles on it. One more story. It said all the apostles were together in Solomon's portico. So again, we have the apostles gathering together. That's what people did in all these porches. Remember, Jerusalem is hot and sunny. You want a shady place. So that's why they had all these huge porches all the way around. It was a place for people to gather, for a teacher to gather with his students, for lots of people just to sit there in the shade as opposed to being there out in the sunshine.
Yeah, this is the sort of thing that really makes the Bible come alive. You know, we read these things and we get these ideas, but like you said, it's hot, and that's it. And it is. If you've ever been on the Temple Mount in the summer, it's exposed. It's up there. It's hot. So these porches are good, cool places for people to go. The porches and porticos, the different roofed areas with the columns. And so this really paints a visual picture for us. And now we're starting to see something as specific as the floor. I'm fascinated.
We know these floors may have also been in any of the semi-covered or covered chambers that surrounded the Temple Mount, or they may have been inside the Temple Mount itself. And
Wow.
there we go. This is me. I'm Frankie. I'm the floor lady. I just do floors.
Oh, that is great. Thank you for sharing the images and the work. How long does it take you? Because are you looking at whole tile pieces or are you looking at just little bits and pieces?
Sometimes I have entire tiles, other times I only have bits and pieces. With the entire tiles, I'm lucky because I can take the measurements and then I can try to think, okay, how does this fit into a pattern? Like that yellow tile you saw in the pinwheel pattern. I looked at that one several times going, what do I do with this? What is this crazy angle? And it wasn't until it dawned on me that the 38-degree angle that I had on the top of it is the complementary angle to a 52, meaning 38 and 52 make a 90-degree angle. And we're going, oh, 52, Herod's triangle. Stick a Herod's triangle right beside it. And you go, okay, now you've got a square corner. I see. It fits into the pinwheel. So I kept looking at the pinwheel pattern, but going, but it's the wrong size. It should be 45. And it was a 38. I'm going, wait a minute, what's going on here? So sometimes it just takes a while for it to dawn on you what goes on. Other times, like the black triangle that I found, that was 1/3 of a Roman foot. I'm going, oh, I know exactly where this goes because in that pattern, the top triangle is 1/3 of a Roman foot. The bottom triangle is 1/3 of a Roman foot. The square in the middle is 1/3 of the Roman foot. And I drew it out on paper. So at the conclusion of the program with that group, I'm going, and the floor would have looked like this, and I could pull it out really quickly and say, I know how this was used, or I know how it could have been used. And so that's what I did all the years that I was working over there with these tiles, is try to figure out how could this have been used. And I came up with 7 different patterns. I showed you most of them on there
Mhm.
that were used on the Temple Mount in Jesus' time. It's the floor that he and his disciples would have walked on. It's the floors that all the Jews coming up there for the holidays would have walked on. And it was part of Herod's beautification project of beautifying the entire Temple Mount for the Jewish people.
I think this is fascinating. So you're taking the bits and pieces, the broken pieces, the bigger pieces, you're looking at them, but you're also doing research. You're going to
I
Herod's
love
other site.
research. Right.
Yeah, you're familiarizing yourself with the
Mhm.
material culture of Herod and his palaces. And so
Yes.
when you're looking at the pieces, you're recognizing where the pieces you're finding fit on the same sorts of patterns.
Right.
This is fascinating to me that you're able to just look around, see what was happening in other places, look at the little pieces and put them together. I'll bet you're really good with jigsaw puzzles.
Yes, that's what people always ask me. You like to do jigsaw puzzles? Yeah.
Oh, that is great. So you went from math into
Yes.
archaeology
Right.
uh, because
I
of
always
what you.
say that. I always say that I'm the mathematician the archaeologists didn't realize they needed. Because
It's true.
until I came along and started working mathematically with this and saying, look, you can reverse engineer this. Basically, at the sites, they knew that tiles were important, so they put them in boxes and put them on the shelves. And they started pulling them off the shelf. Some of them had been there for 20 years. One set was there for 35 years. Another box had been sitting there for 50 years. And they're saying, okay, now that somebody knows how to work with these, I started getting all these tiles from all these different sites all over the country as the archaeologists are going, wait a minute, what we needed all along was a mathematician.
Right.
And they didn't have a mathematician who was working with them. So I was their mathematician.
So
I
we've
became an
seen.
archaeologist.
Yeah, and that's how I know you. But we've seen your process of how you looked at the geometry and you found overlapping images like the stars, the larger ones, the smaller ones, and you said you sat and looked at the one for a long time and like how was this constructed? So how long did this take you? And I guess with each floor it's probably different, but I can imagine this would take an incredible amount of time. First of all, to decipher the bits and pieces and see what the puzzle pieces look like, but then to try to see how they fit together. how does that process work?
Sometimes I could start working with tiles, and by looking at patterns of popular Roman tiles, I could sort of figure out what was going on. But other ones, it took years of, looking at it and going, I really don't know. Put it away for a while and pulling it out later. Okay, what do I know now? Have I learned enough to figure out what to do with this? No, I'm still stumped by this one. And then all of a sudden, one day you'll just see it. It just pops into your mind. Well, I see what's going on now. Like that Jericho floor. I had stared at that pattern. For years, I would look at it and go, this is a really neat floor, but I don't understand how they generated the pattern. And then all of a sudden, one day, it was like, it's an optical illusions. All of a sudden, something will pop out at you. And the four-pointed star popped out at me, and I'm going, oh my gosh, this is so simple. And it's so gorgeous, and it's unique, and it is so arid, to do something like this.
Yes, it is. And you talk about the beauty of such a thing. And there is certainly something to be said for the artistic history, or the history of the art, and the value of the art. And you have put these things together. And I know if you go to the city of David, where you go down into what's believed to maybe be David's palace and down into Hezekiah's tunnel, that right outside the gift shop area there, for anyone who's ever been there, there is a large section with images of these tiles, but also in the Israel Museum, I understand there's some things. What is the legacy of this work you're doing? Where is it going to go down the road?
The first big exhibit that I had was at the Israel Museum in 2013, where I constructed a floor using the actual tiles from Herodian and Kypros for an exhibit that was there for a year-long exhibit on King Herod's architecture. That floor is not currently on exhibit, but we're going to pull it out again as part of another exhibit in the next couple of years. And the floor at the City of David is the one that I was commissioned by the City of David to design a floor for them, to show people the different patterns and colors that were used on the Temple Mount. Because if you go up on the Temple Mount today, everything is cream colored limestone. But we hear about, oh, there's all these bright colors, and you go, where? And so the City of David asked me to create the floor for them. So I designed it and worked with local masons there in order to construct it. And it's on exhibit right there in the City of David to show people what the Temple Mount floors look like. It's not to represent any specific floor, but just to give them an idea of patterns and colors and the dynamic beauty of the place.
Wow, that is fascinating, and it was really neat. I'd been to that site several times, and honestly, it wasn't until my last visit that it was pointed out, that I even saw it there, and it was pointed out.
Around 2017, 2018 is when we installed it. So
okay.
Earlier times that you went there, it wasn't there. That's right.
Okay, well that's good to know. But it was just it was neat to be able to see that and to be able to picture it, because you see pictures of it in magazines and in books and on videos like this, but to be able to see it as a floor is something. Speaking of magazines, so I just wanted to point out that the spring and summer issue of Bible and Spade magazine from Associates for Biblical Research has an article on this very thing. It's the cover article by our very own Frankie Snyder, and I think that's really cool. So it's fascinating to look at this piece of history and to have an image of what things must have been like. This is just another little bit in the material culture that helps us to understand the world of the Bible. Frankie, we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much for your insight. I am impressed with what you do. It fascinates me. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And to be able to tell people about the things that we find, but not just what we find, but what we understand from them. And, you know, you can talk about bits and pieces of broken stones, but unless you make something that's really visual out of it for people to understand how these floors were used, you know, it's kind of meaningless. So I'm glad that as a mathematician, I could help the archaeological world by recreating King Herod's floors.
No, we're grateful that your mathematical background has brought you into the world of archaeology, and your contributions have really been something. You've been watching Biblically Grounded. We've been talking with Frankie Snyder about King Herod's floors on the Temple Mount, and specifically about Herod's Triangle. Thank you once again, Frankie.
Thank you.